There are 39 people on death row in the state of Oklahoma. This is part 5 of the series. Clarence Rosell Good, 18 years on death row. 3 people, including a 10-year-old child, were killed in Owasso in 2005, and Clarence Rosell Good was found guilty of their deaths. In connection with the deaths of Mitch Thompson, Tara Burkett Thompson, and Tara's 10-year-old daughter Kayla, Good was one of 3 men charged with first-degree murder. The men and Thompson got into a fight, which got problematic to the point that the men came into the house with guns and shot each of the victims many times. After a separate trial, a Tulsa County jury found Good guilty of all 3 counts of murder. For each of the 3, he received the death penalty. Wendell Grom, 15 years on death row. Grissom drove his white Chevrolet truck out of Arkansas and onto Interstate 40, heading west on November 2, 2005. He picked up a hitchhiker named Jesse Johns, who was homeless just beyond the state line in Oklahoma. The 2 men drank whiskey and got to know one another while traveling west. They also talked about robbing or breaking into properties in order to raise money. Grissom paid $260 for a weekly rental when they checked into a hotel in Oklahoma City later that evening. That night, Jesse Johns slept on the floor. Wendell Grissom demonstrated how to load a black powder handgun with a .44 caliber to Jesse Jones the next morning. This was one of the 2 guns that he had with him at the moment. On their way west on Interstate 40 in the vehicle that morning, the 2 men continued to drink. Their trip at the Love's Country Store on exit 108 at approximately 10:45 a.m. saw each man purchasing a pair of brown cotton gloves, as captured by security cameras. From there, they searched for a house to break into by driving into rural Blaine County. Grissom parked his truck in the driveway of Matt and Drew Kopp's house in rural Blaine County close to Hitchcock. He gave Jesse Jones instructions to hold off on helping him break into the residence until the gunfire had stopped. Grissom went up to a sliding door in the back of the house and tapped. That morning, Drew Kopf, her best friend Amber Matthews, and her 2 small daughters, Riley, age 18 months, and Gracie Jo, age 1, were inside her home. Gracie was being held by Mrs. Kopf while Riley was in her cot in the bedroom. As Mrs. Kopf turned in her glider rocker to talk with Grissom, Mrs. Matthews answered the sliding glass door. He asked Mrs. Kopf if her husband was home. She replied that her husband was at work. Grissom promised to return at a later time. After Mrs. Matthews shut the door, Grissom reappeared a short while later. After giving the infant to Mrs. Matthews, Mrs. Kopf went back to the door. Grissom broke through the huge glass pane by shooting towards it. Then he entered the house and shot Mrs. Kopf a second time, hitting her in the hand. The infant and Amber Matthews rushed into Riley's bedroom. After a struggle, Mrs. Kopf shoved the intruder onto a couch across the room. She begged Grissom to take what he wanted and go, as she was on top of him struggling. Taking the black powder pistol from his belt and putting it to her head, he simply chuckled at her. As he shot, she reached for the gun, but a bullet broke through her fingers and pierced her skull on the side. Grissom then fired again, jamming the large pistol into her hip. Mrs. Kopf was thrown to the ground by the force of this shot. Wendell Grissom made his way to the bedroom where Mrs. Matthews and the kids were. The report from Grissom's pistol and Mrs. Matthews pleading for her life were then heard by Mrs. Kopf. After breaking out of the house, Mrs. Kopf went to her garage and opened the overhead door. She realized she could not run and that she was giving her killer a trail of blood to follow. She bolted toward the road after spotting the white truck in her driveway. Jesse Jones had heard multiple gunshots and had exited the truck to approach the home. He watched as Mrs. Kopf fled the residence. As soon as he passed through the broken door, Grissom was standing over an injured Amber Matthews. He watched as Mrs. Matthews was hit by another round of fire by Grissom. Grissom was then informed by Jones that someone had fled the house. Running towards the truck, Wendell Grissom attempted to climb inside and shot Mrs. Kopf once more with his pistol as she drove away. Not far from her home, Drew Kopf stopped 3 truck drivers who were moving rock and informed them that she had been shot along with her children and friend. One of the truck drivers, a retired police officer himself, got into the vehicle. He drove Mrs. Kopf to the hospital in neighboring Watonga after reporting the shooting over the phone to the Kingfisher County Sheriff's Office. Wendell Grissom and Johns tried to flee the crime scene on a red 4-wheeler ATV they discovered in the Kopf family garage after realizing their plans had been disrupted. A postal worker noticed a black dog pursuing 2 men on the red 4-wheeler as they left the Kopf home. The criminals sped by the rock haulers, who had just moments before encountered Drew Kopf. After a short while, the men ran out of gas, but they were able to catch a ride with a passing farmer who thought they were laborers. He drove them to a Hilltop Cafe, which is located on Highway 33, just over the Kingfisher County border. When the two women in charge of the Hilltop Cafe that day observed two males peering in the store's windows from the outside and inside parked automobiles, they were alarmed. Then the two men entered the shop. Each purchased a separate beer can. One of the clerks reported them to the Kingfisher County Sheriff's Office. Additionally, the store's only customer, a local man who was waiting for lunch, was requested to stay with the clerks until the two foreigners left. Officers from Kingfisher County Sheriff's Department now sprinted in the direction of the Hilltop Cafe, realizing that there might be a connection to the report of a shooting at the neighboring Kopf residence approximately 30 minutes earlier. Following the original report of a shooting, emergency services from the nearby area, together with officers from the Watonga Police Department, the Blaine County Sheriff's Office, and the Oklahoma Highway Patrol, arrived at the Kopf residence. Officers slowly made their way to the house, where they discovered the Kopf children still alive. Amber Matthews was critically injured and rendered unconscious. On a medical evacuation aircraft to a hospital in Oklahoma City, she passed away. Now walking down the road, Jesse Jones was approached by a Kingfisher County deputy sheriff and taken into custody for further investigation back at the Hilltop Cafe. After asking him a few quick questions and checking him for weapons, the deputy drove Jones back to the Hilltop Cafe. Law enforcement officials kept collecting information in the interim regarding the crimes at the Kopf residence and the strange individuals that were reported at the Hilltop. Jesse Jones was taken into custody by the police around 45 minutes later on suspicion of participating in the theft of a fourth-wheeler and other offenses at the Kopf home. Wendell Grom was later found by investigators hidden in a pile of rocks next to the Hilltop Cafe. John Hansen, 23 years on death row, after he and an accomplice abducted retired banker Mary Agnes Bowles from a Tulsa mall on August 31, 1999, Hansen is expected to be executed for the fatal shooting. The victim was 77 years old. They intended to go on a robbery rampage using her car. According to testimony at his trial, Hansen shot her in a ditch close to Owasso after the accomplice shot and killed Gerald Thurman, the owner of a dirt pit, who had seen them on his land. Afterwards, he told a friend that everything went bad. Marlon Dion Harmon, 15 years on death row. In connection with Kamal Chowdhury's passing, Harmon was found guilty of first-degree murder. The 55-year-old Chowdhury owned Q&S Food Store. In the robbery of his store on August 23, 2004, he was shot 3 times and died the next day. Before Harmon was even an adult, he was incarcerated, and following his release, he committed several more robberies. Harmon was 27 years old when he received the death penalty. Donnie Lee Harris, 9 years on death row. Donnie Lee Harris was sentenced by District Court Judge John Sullivan for the death of 25-year-old Christy Ferguson on March 9, 2012. He was found guilty by the jury of dousing Ferguson with gasoline late on February 18, 2012, and then starting a fire. Ferguson was burned over 42.5% of her body, the majority of which were third-degree burns. Ferguson's injuries caused complications that led to her death 19 days later. Christy and Harris had dissolved their relationship. Harris had threatened to hurt her family if she hadn't gone with him, which is why she was there that evening. Donnie Harris expressed regret to Christy Ferguson's family as well as his own, stating he misses her every day. Christy has a son who was just 6 years old when his mother died. The boy is living with his grandmother and spends a lot of time with his grandfather as well. Raymond Eugene Johnson, 16 years on death row. In Tulsa County, Raymond Eugene Johnson was found guilty of killing both his girlfriend and her little daughter. For the 2007 murders of 24-year-old Brooke Whitaker and her 7-month-old daughter Kia, Johnson received 2 death sentences. He repeatedly struck his girlfriend with a hammer before dousing her with gasoline and setting her ablaze. The bodies of Whitaker and her daughter were discovered within the burnt remnants of their house. Johnson was also given a life sentence for arson, in addition to the death penalties. Back in 1995, he was also charged with manslaughter. Derek Tyrell Leday, 6 years on death row. Charges of first-degree murder have been brought against 2 brothers and their girlfriends for the 2015 stabbing death of an Oklahoma City man whose body was then transported and set ablaze. Dennis Johnson Jr., 34 years old, was murdered in retaliation for allegedly robbing one of the couples of cash, weapons, and drugs. Derek Tyrell LaDay, his girlfriend Anna Maria Cruz, and Aaron Tyrone LaDay, his girlfriend Teresa Mary McDonald, were charged with first-degree murder. In Oklahoma County District Court, the 2 couples and 4 other people were also accused with conspiring to defile and violate a human corpse. Together, the 8 moved the victim's body from Oklahoma City to Ada so that gasoline could be used to burn him. Investigators claim that the victim robbed Derek LaDay and his girlfriend before the killing happened. According to a witness, Derek LaDay and Cruz located the thief, brought him to a home in Oklahoma City, and fatally beat him. Derek LaDay stabbed the victim and burned him, according to a different witness. On June 11, 2015, Aaron LaDay, McDonald, Derek LaDay, and Cruz were inside the Oklahoma City home with the victim. Johnson's body was discovered early on June 12, 2015 in Pontotoc County beneath a bridge following the extinguishment of a fire by Ada firefighters. Tiona Lynn Wilson, 20 years old at the time, of Bethany, Anthony Deshaun Franklin, 24 years old, of Ada, Eric Juarez, 17 years old, of Oklahoma City, and Halinda Rex, 17 years old, of Oklahoma City, were charged in connection with the lesser offenses. Derek LaDay called Franklin on June 12, 2015, and stated he had killed a guy and needed someplace to get rid of the body. Franklin gave Derek LaDay and the others instructions on where to dispose of the body when they arrived in Ada. Juarez, Rex, and Wilson, who is identified as Derek LaDay's sister, were also accused with first-degree murder accessory after the fact. According to the accusations, after murdering victim Dennis Johnson, they set fire to the LaDay's brothers and their girlfriend's clothes to get rid of the evidence. Derek LaDay's car had 3 spots that proved to be the victim's blood. Johnson served time in prison for offenses involving drugs and domestic violence. Please hit that subscribe button if you like my channel. See you next time. Bye bye.